Good morning, everybody. I'm really delighted to welcome you to a network webinar of the Ontario Network of CAPC and CPNP projects. Today is October 16th, 2020, and we are here with Angela Mashford-Pringle, and I will introduce her more in a moment and then hand things over to her. But before we do that, I just have a few housekeeping items that I wanted to share with you. First, I would like to take a moment to offer a territorial acknowledgement. The Ontario Network of CAPC and CPNP projects acknowledges and gives thanks to the First Peoples of the territories where we work and serve, and other Indigenous peoples for sharing this land in order for us to continue our work with families all across Ontario. I myself am located in Kitchener-Waterloo, which is situated on land that is the traditional home of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe and Neutral people. I want to let you know that this session will run about 90 minutes with a 60-minute presentation and about a half hour allotted to questions. If you have questions, feel free to post it in the chat and I will bring it forward to Angela. So again, I will ask everybody to mute themselves and to stay off camera as we are recording this for our archive. A couple other things I wanted to let you know is that we do have a closed captioning service that is active now on our Zoom gatherings. So on your Zoom screen, you should see a menu item that says closed caption. And if you click on the up arrow, you should be able to select view or show subtitles. So actually, even if you don't need subtitles and you would be willing to try them out for me, I would love to hear feedback from them because this isn't a new service that we have. So I want to just let everybody know that. And again, remind everybody that this session is being recorded. And I think that's all my housekeeping items. So again, I would like to welcome Angela Mashford-Pringle. She is here from the University of Toronto, and her session is on Truth and Reconciliation. What does it mean for CAPC and CPNP? So Angela, I will hand it over to you to introduce yourself a little bit more and to lead us through your discussion. And remember, I'm here for you if you need anything.
Sure, thank you so much. Welcome to everybody. I know it's Friday and it's early in the morning and everybody's raring to go right now. So I'm going to try to do this in a nice, gentle way. And we're going to try to go through a whole bunch of things, and some things will make you feel a little uncomfortable, but hopefully at the end of the day, you will really appreciate what I've given you today. So my name is Angela Mashford-Pringle. I'm from Temiskaming First Nation in Northern Quebec, but I was born and raised here in Toronto. I'm an assistant professor and the associate director of the Waakebiness-Bryce Institute for Indigenous Health at the Dalalana School of Public Health at the University of Toronto. And I'm going to say Indigenous Health a couple times here now. I am the program director for the Masters of Public Health in Indigenous Health and the program director for the collaborative specialization in Indigenous Health, as well as being the founding editor of the Turtle Island Journal of Indigenous Health. So those are like all my big titles that I try to get out. I'm Bear Clan. I have two wonderful grown daughters. Grown when I say that they're grown in terms of age, maybe not so much in terms of still living at home and wanting mom. One's 19 and one's about to turn 22. I've been an assistant professor now for 2 years, and I used to work at the Public Health Agency of Canada. I was a program consultant, and I started as a program support clerk in Aboriginal Head Start, and then I moved on to becoming a program consultant in, I think, 2002. So I have a very good sense of what you guys are about to, or what we're about to embark on and talk about. So I want to welcome you. Kwe Kwe, Bozo, Tanzi, Ani, Sego. These are all different words that denote how to say hello or welcome in Indigenous languages. And I just bring this up because often people think of Indigenous people in this pan-Indigenous way, and I want you to know that there's a number of different people in our territory in Ontario, and they may not be the original people from Ontario, but they may be people who are here. So we have people from the Cherokee Nation, we have people from Cree and Algonquin and Dene, and the Haudenosaunee peoples, the Mohawk peoples. So there's tons of different people in Ontario, and even if you're not fully aware that they're coming to your project, they probably are. So just learning a little bit of the language may be helpful. Not that you would have a lot of language speakers, but it is one way for us to connect as service providers. So today, based on what I was asked to do, I thought I would give you a little bit of the history. I know sometimes it's kind of boring, but we got to go through it so that you understand how we got to here and how we move forward into reconciliation. I want to give you some time to think about how self-reflection and anti-racism in our early childhood programs could be done, and then give you some activities and readings that you can do when you're in your project to help move us forward into reconciliation. So when I teach in person, this is one of the things that I teach often. And in early childhood, this is actually like a no-brainer. You often sit in a circle with people. You don't sit in a square. You you don't think of yourself in front of them or behind them, above them or below them. You see everybody's equal. That's the one thing I loved about working with children's programs is everybody was equal. Now, this doesn't hold true when you get outside of children's programs. People often think about how they can move to the next rung on a ladder, or they're worried about getting in the line ahead of you, or being told that they're doing better than you. And I think it's important for us to pull back a little bit and think about the pandemic in particular has made it so that we have to start seeing people in an equal way. We may not have been doing that in the past, but I think it's highly important that we do it now. And so, pardon me, and so part of that is to think of everybody in a circle. When I teach at the university, one of the problems we have is you have lecture halls where people can't see anything but the back of your head, right, because they're sitting behind you. Meaning that they can never see you smile, or they can't hear you giggle at something, or see that you're stressed out about something that's being taught about. And so part of being in a circle makes sure that everybody's equal, and it means that we have the chance to listen to each other on the same level, which we may not do in other settings. So always think about ways that you can use the circle in the things that you do. I know you already do with children, but try doing that with parents, and try doing that with caregivers, and seeing how they react to being able to see each other. It is quite an interesting little experiment, if you will, in terms of trying to see how people see each other. So this circle, obviously there are different chairs because there are different people that are going to sit around our table and talk to each other. So I know Sydney already did the land acknowledgement. I've put a link up here for you guys if you want to go check this one out. This is the one for Toronto that was specially made by Chief Lady Bird and some other Indigenous people here in Toronto. The idea is when you hear a land acknowledgement, it's not meant to be just here we're acknowledging that we're on somebody else's territory and you're done, which happens quite often, and I'm not faulting anybody, but we have to get beyond that now. Now we know that we're on this land. We have to start thinking about what that means. So why are you in particular acknowledging that land that you're on? So today, why are we acknowledging the land in Ontario? Well, we're acknowledging it because there's treaties here, and we know that there are Indigenous peoples here. And we need to start thinking about what that means in terms of the work we do, in terms of how we live, we work, we play with the land or on the land. And so often people say to me, well, I never thought about where I play or where I work. So I know we were having conversations before this started, and I've been pretty much across Ontario. I've seen a lot of the CAPC CPNP and Head Start projects here in the province. And some of them are very cognizant of the land that they're working on. So people are cognizant of the fact that they're working in a specific territory. They may be aware of it, but are they thinking about that land and how it would have traditionally been used? Are they thinking about the people that can't use it in the traditional way anymore? So I want you to think about that. And the one thing that, at least for me, the pandemic has brought to focus is, while I saw nature and I spent time with the land and on the land, I maybe wasn't thinking about the land that I live on. So, you know, right now, tap your feet on the floor. I don't care if you're outside or inside, it doesn't matter. You're on land. How often do you think about that land that's underneath your feet? Even if you're in a high rise, you're still on land somewhere. And so you need to start thinking about, what does it mean to be connected to that land? We talk a lot about climate change and environmental issues, and this is your way to start reflecting on that every day. What does it mean to be caretakers of this land? Because Indigenous people have been displaced across Canada, we as just Canadians have to start thinking about how we think about that land, and we honor that land because that's the land that keeps you alive. So I work with Knowledge Keeper Clay Shirt, and his little teaching to me that he says quite often is, you know, if tomorrow all humans disappeared, everything else in the world would survive. And in fact, it would thrive without us. The waters would clear, the animals would keep going on, the insects would still be there, the sun would shine, the moon would come up, the grasses would grow, the rivers would flow. But if everything else in nature disappeared, humans couldn't survive. So it's important for us to reflect on the fact that we're only part of a cycle, and that we're not the top of a cycle, which is the way that our entire society has been built. Our society is built on the fact that humans can, you know, change up what they want, when they want, and how they want for profit. And that also has an impact on children, because we're teaching it to children as well. And so often this stuff plays on the environment, and that has a huge effect on you as a person. So if you're not taking the time to be in balance in your physical, spiritual, emotional, and mental aspects of yourself, you're going to have trouble doing your daily tasks, which means you're also going to have trouble reflecting on the land. So in my class this year, I even asked my students, spend 30 minutes today, go out and take pictures with your phone. Everybody has a phone. I want you to just take pictures of the land that you are around all the time. Because I bet you if you took a 30-minute walk, there's going to be things that you hadn't really noticed before. And specifically right now, because we have the beautiful colors of fall coming in, are there things that you hadn't really noticed before? And are there places of serenity for you in your local area that maybe you hadn't really paid attention to? So we need to think about those things. And we also need to think about, you know, when you're taking that walk, I want you to listen for birds and insects and animals, because they're still out right now, and see, like, have you thought about those, the other beings in your path every day? Because this is also important. And how do we teach that to children? That's also very important. Having them outside. So there's different ways to teach them, but having them outside, you could teach them from the land, not necessarily from a curriculum. So have you learned about the land that you live on? So while we acknowledge all of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, have you actually taken time to find out about the treaties in your area or the people that still reside there? So if you're outside of Toronto, you would have very specific people that live in your, or were from your land. In particular, if you were from, let's just say you're from Timmins, you have a very specific group of people versus if you were from, say, Peterborough. So it depends on where you're from. You should get to know their history, the treaties that go there, and the current issues that they're facing. This will help you when you're working with Indigenous people, but it also helps you to understand the fight that they've had up until today. So I want you to also think about your terminology. So you heard me introduce myself, and it was a lot. It seems like it's long-winded when I introduce myself because I try to connect all the things that I have. But I want you to think about how you introduce yourself on a daily basis. Do you just introduce yourself with your name? Do you introduce yourself with your professional credentials? Do you introduce yourself about your ethnicity or your gender? I know I've noticed, it's just interesting to note, as I was looking through the list of people here today, that you guys don't do what I see students doing, which I think is very interesting all by itself, which is students tend to put their name and then right beside it in Zoom, they have their pronouns. So they'll have she, her, or he, him right beside their name on there. So when they log into Zoom, I can tell everything about them in that 3 to 5 second time frame as I'm seeing people log into my Zoom calls. And it's interesting that I don't see anybody doing that here, so it might be something you might want to think about, because we forget that gender pronouns are also an issue, right? And that we in Indigenous circles, if you're talking from our Indigenous languages, don't actually have words for he and she in some languages, so we would have been gender neutral all the way along. It was more about your relationship to a person than your gender. So when you talk about yourself, do you bring these up? Is there something else that you bring up when you introduce yourself, or is it simply just your name? So I want you to take time. Sydney will have the slides to send to people if they want them, but I want you to think about how you introduce yourself. I know this slide is from when I teach, but you should be thinking about this when you're introducing yourself either within your project or to other people that you meet. Are you situating yourself on the territory? So you heard me say I'm from Temiskaming First Nation, and that's in northern Quebec, but I was born and raised here in Toronto. Do you do that? My students have learned to say that they're settlers and where their ancestry comes from. Even if they're 4th or 5th generation in Canada, they always try to acknowledge the fact that this isn't their land. Are there other labels that you want to associate with yourself? So thinking about who you are, it's really important. And why did I bring up land acknowledgements and who you are at the beginning? Because in order for you to get to reconciliation, you need to acknowledge both of those. Because identity is political, it's social, and it's personal. So when we identify ourselves, we're identifying ourselves in a very political way. By me saying that I'm Indigenous, that I'm First Nations, I'm truly telling you a lot about myself. I've exposed myself in such a way that if there were 5 more Indigenous people and we were standing around, not in COVID, they could actually still arrest us because that would be a gathering of more than 5. And every time there's a gathering of more than 5, it's in the Indian Act in order to get, to disband those kinds of gatherings. It's also social. The way that you introduce yourself may be how you want somebody to perceive you. So you may be introducing yourself first with your titles. So I could have introduced myself as Angela Mashford-Pringle, assistant professor, but I always choose to acknowledge who I am before I acknowledge my professional affiliations. And it's just a choice, but it also shows you how identity can be really affected that way. And it's very personal. So people take offense when you put a title on them that they didn't have. So nobody wants negative connotations with their name. And so you have to be very cognizant of how you introduce yourself in order to make sure that you don't do it to somebody else. So these maps just really show you the treaty areas in Canada. We'll talk a little bit about all of that, but as you can see, there's a lot of yellow in the one map on the left, and that is because we have a lot of territory in Canada that is not treated. So all of that yellow is untreated territory. The map on the right is just to show you there's a whole bunch of different First Nations people across North America, and or Turtle Island, however you want to put it. And Turtle Island doesn't stop with Canada and the US, it goes all the way into to Mexico, or what we know as Mexico today. And so as you can see, these are language groups more than they are anything else. but those language groups go with nations. So you'll see some nations are bigger than others. You will see that they kind of may have more than one place. And this is the original placement of these nations, but people move and things changed. And now for First Nations, American Indian and Alaskan Natives across, and Inuit across Turtle Island, we've pretty much been decimated into about 2% of the land mass. So that brings me to thinking about Indigenous worldviews, and we have to think about the land first. So we did our acknowledgement, and I talked about how my identity is political and social and personal. So that also told you how I relate to my community and to my kinship ties. And I could have gone a different route. I've also heard people introduce themselves in the sense that they talk about who their mother is. So for a lot of Indigenous communities, we're maternal lineage, even though in Canada and I think most of the US, you get your last name from your father, not your mother. Traditionally, that's not how it works. You got your clan and your name from your mother's community. And so not in everyone, but in a lot. And that showed you kinship. So you may say that I passed through the waters of Margaret, who passed through the waters of Edna, who passed through the waters of Rose, who passed through the waters of Julie. And that tells you just about my lineage. And I didn't give their full names, but you get a sense of what I'm talking about. And when we interact with the land, we were given our language. So to describe things around us, our language comes from the land. And from our language and our interactions with the land, our culture emerges. And so you see a lot of Indigenous communities with cultural ideals that come from the land. And all of this together becomes very holistic. So all my relations, everything in creation is my relation, because at some point, the trees talk to the plants, and the animals could talk to the trees and the plants, and the rocks and the soil and the water. And at some point, we've forgotten all of that. And we've gotten to the point where we think that we as humans are the be-all, end-all. And we have to keep remembering that we are not just a physical being, or we're not just mentally present, but we have spirit as well. And that the mind, the body, and the spirit have to be married into everything we do. And that we have to try to keep balance in all of these things at the same time, which means you're spending a lot of your time focused on how you're keeping that balance, rather than being what I consider busy work. And I'm one to say that because I do a lot of different projects, but we forget these things, this simple way of being. And I think everybody wants to, but we've forgotten how to even get there. So that brings me to the idea of two-eyed seeing. And last year I was very fortunate. I got to sit with Elder Albert Marshall, who originated this idea with his late wife, Modena. And I got a whole weekend with Albert. It was quite fun. He was explaining to me how two-eyed seeing was a theory at the beginning, and now he knows how to put it into practice. And so part of this slide is just to kind of give you a sense of how to first to see it, and then I'm going to just kind of tell you how to put it into practice. So his idea was, if you have your two eyes and one eye only, for most people, you're looking through a Western lens. So it would be the blue eye with the darker lens. And you see everything in the world that way. But say you meet an Indigenous person and you start to understand Indigenous ways of knowing or being. So you could see things through an Indigenous lens. But rather than only looking through one of the two lenses at any given time, Albert suggests that you look through both. So what he's saying is you need to don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, whichever one you have as your primary you use, but then you need to learn the other one. And you need to learn to put both of those lenses on the problems or the issues or the things that you're doing, so that we're integrating the two. But that's not to say we want them so that you're so integrated that you're not able to focus on anything else. So what he was suggesting to me was, you want to be able to put on the set of glasses with both of them on and try to look through two different visions. And while it sounds difficult, as you do this more and more, the easier this will become. So the more that you can see, you know how to live your life in the Western lens, but what does it look like to live from an Indigenous lens? So, for example, if you're looking at a flower through a Western lens, you could be saying it's beautiful, I want to study it, I want to find out its properties, where it grows, or what it does, that kind of thing. From an Indigenous lens, you may be looking at it, not touching it, because you want to figure out what comes to it, where it's growing, why it's growing there, what keeps it alive. And so those two lenses together give you a richer view of that flower than one of them alone. Which brings us to what I've been talking about a lot. It's a huge problem, but it's something that we have to, it's a mind shift that we need people to take. If you think about capitalism and you think about everything we do in our world, right now we're situated in this right part of the picture with men or human beings on the top and animals, plants, and trees, and all of those, and nature in total being underneath us or being for our benefit. But if we go from an Indigenous perspective, everything is interconnected. So nobody's on the top and nobody's on the bottom, but rather everybody's part of that web. And we have to start thinking that way so that we can fix our environment, so that, you know, the little humans in our life will have something in the future. Because if we keep going at the rate we're going, there is no future for the planet. So I'm going to begin a little bit with about who Indigenous people are. I'm sure you've heard the terminology, so I don't think I need to go through a terminology section too much. But I will say there's First Nations, there's Métis, and there's Inuit people in Canada. All three are the recognized groups, and you'll still hear the term Aboriginal or Aboriginal peoples. That's because it's in our Constitution. You'll still hear the word Indian, but people try not to use it because, first of all, there's other Indians in Canada now, which makes it kind of confusing if you're trying to talk that way. But on top of that, we found that that word was used in a negative way, and so we try to stay away from that word. You'll also hear people say things like half-breed, meaning Métis people, and that's an unacceptable term. And right now, we're in a fight with the Edmonton football team to change their name because Eskimo is also a hurtful word. So these are things that you just need to know in terms of who we're talking about, but we'll get to that. So the Royal Proclamation. Wow, it's been a long time. It's actually October 19th, 1763. The King of England wrote the Royal Proclamation, King George, and he basically said that you couldn't extinguish any of the Indigenous rights because we were clearly here first, and that anything that was going to happen here would have to go through his agents here in North America. It was all about land couldn't be sold without notice, and you just couldn't take things. You just couldn't squat places. It specifically states that title, so being First Nations, was never taken away, and we were still sovereign people, and we were supposed to be able to live on our lands and do our own thing. Now, jump forward about 100 years and you get to the British North America Act, or the beginning of Canada in 1867. And here you have First Nations people becoming wards of the state. So what happens is the British North America Act says, well, you know, we don't think you're civilized enough, so we don't think you can do things on your own. We're just going to make you part of Canada's wards, and we're going to deal with you, and we're going to make sure everything runs smoothly from there. And so they make them wards of the state, meaning that it was like a parent-child relationship. So the government becomes the parent, and Indigenous people become the children, and everything that they want to do has to be okayed. The Indian Act, less than 9 years after the start of the country, comes. This is the time frame that a lot of social Darwinism comes from. It's also the time frame that, if you're watching the news right now, you'll hear people talking about Sir John A. Macdonald and the amount of racism and discrimination that was going on in that period. It's a lot to do with the Indian Act and the BNA, because both of those were under John A. Macdonald, and both of those were edging us towards the eradication, not assimilation, the eradication of First Nations and Inuit peoples. Not so much the Inuit, because they weren't really in the north at that point, but they were really worried about the First Nations people. And so there's this huge issue in terms of our history that we don't want to talk about, or doesn't seem to get talked about enough, where Indigenous people were pushed to the background in order to hopefully eradicate them. It's in this time frame that we had a problem with smallpox blankets. I'm telling you this because it's important to know in terms of today in the pandemic and how that's affecting Indigenous peoples and families and communities, and why they're pushing back a little bit. And why is this all important? Well, to get to reconciliation, if we're not going to talk about our history, then we can't actually get there, because we're not actually talking about the issues that underlie truth. So when we say truth and reconciliation, you need to talk about the truth in order to get to the reconciliation. Now, the Indian Act clearly states who, well, it doesn't clearly, the Indian Act states who is First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, and really only worries itself about First Nations and Inuit peoples, and more so to First Nations than Inuit. Part of some of the dilemmas are the British North America Act made pretty much everything a provincial responsibility, like health and education. But they had the responsibility for the federal government has responsibility for 5 groups: the military, the RCMP, prisoners, refugees and immigrants, and Indigenous people. And so this becomes a problem, because if you need education and you're Indigenous, where are you getting it from? If you're looking for healthcare, where are you getting it from? So that starts a policy problem, but that also starts a divide that has never gone away, because this has never been corrected. There's been numerous amendments to the Indian Act. What you really need to know is there's been lots of bans or restrictions or mandatory issues that have gone on, and we'll talk about a few of them, but this is the history that doesn't get taught often enough, and our children aren't getting taught it. So this is where all the residential schools were in Canada, and I say were because some have totally been taken down, others are still there, but there's roughly 130 schools, residential schools across Canada. There are also day schools, and what I want you to notice is take a look at where the schools are, and you'll notice that they're where we have population today, right? Where most of our First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people live are where you don't see the dots. And so often First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children were taken to residential schools that were far away from and far removed from their communities. Specifically, if you're looking in Nunavut, there's only 2 schools, and everybody from across the region, if they were found, were taken to those schools. Similarly, we have Inuit on this side of Quebec, and a lot of this area made it so that they had to come down into southern Quebec to go to school, or sometimes they were even flown out of province. So just again, I want you to think about parents and think about the parents that you work with, and how do they feel about their kids, and if their kids right now from 0 to 6 were taken from them, how would they feel? Think about what that does to parents, to families, to children. And this happened for about 100 years, because the last residential school in Saskatchewan, right there, doesn't close until 1996. And so while we have a gradual slowdown of use of residential schools between the 1970s and 1980s, again, still within most of our lifetimes, this is not acceptable. And that's why we still have intergenerational traumas going on. The other thing that they noticed was in the 40s and 50s, they started to realize the residential schools and the day schools weren't actually working for what they wanted, which was to keep the child, but to get rid of the cultural Indigenous part of them. And so they decided that between the change in the Indian Act in 1951 and the fact that residential schools weren't working, they decided to move social welfare over into the provincial realm in 1951. And provinces had wonderful social workers who had never, ever had to work with Indigenous people. And for the most part, had never seen or been with Indigenous people, because at that point we were kind of separated. And so what happens is they start going into homes looking for them to have lots of food and clean houses and clean children, and that wasn't happening. And so a lot of children got taken, and that's part of the 60 scoop, which is still going on today. They've just changed some of the regulations, but it's still happening with yesterday was the first day that Ontario stopped issuing birth alerts on, it was primarily First Nations women, where they would send the social worker the day the baby was born to take the baby from the parents. As of, or from the government's perspective, 11,132 status First Nations children were taken and adopted out between 1960 and 1990. What you're seeing in the picture is there used to be ads in the newspaper about the child, just like you would do if you were advertising to get rid of something. And it would say that, you know, this friendly little child is looking for a home. And the piece that people don't really realize is that those ads, the government was getting paid for the adoptions. So they would get the child for free. I hate to say this, like a commodity. And then they would sell the children to people around the globe. We had children from Canada that went into Europe, into England, Ireland, Germany, France. A lot went into the United States in order to try to get rid of the Indian problem, or the First Nations problem, as the government saw it. And so this happened for quite some time. And the argument is now that the 60 scoops turned into the millennial scoop, and really the same thing's still happening. So what's happened in the last 50 years? We're not going to go through absolutely everything. That would be crazy and insane, because I do that in a 12-week course, and I don't think we can do it in one day. But you have the white paper in 1969, which is trying to eradicate or abolish the Indian Act, which would get rid of rights. The red paper, which is the First Nations rebuttal to that. There's a lot of talk about Indian control over Indian education in 1972. The biggest and most substantial changes to the Indian Act happened in 1985 under Bill C-31. We just recently celebrated the 30 years since the Oka crisis in Quebec. There was the World Summit for Children. This is how you guys can tell that I used to work in CAPC and CPNP, because I always put this into all my slides. The announcement of Head Start happens in 93, so does CAPC and, no, just CAPC. And then Head Start on Reserve happens in 94. And then you have the creation of CPNP. If I had thought about it, it should have gone in there in 95. The RCAP, it takes, so at the end of the Oka crisis, they start this Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in 91, and it takes them 5 years to collect all the data. It's 4,000 pages, there's 440 recommendations. Change of government, nobody ever looks at it. It's a huge ass tomb of things that nobody's ever worked on. The Kelowna Accord, which is one of the failed constitutional talks, had the most amount of indigeneity in it. There was supposed to be $5 billion to try to rectify the issues that Indigenous communities faced, but Paul Martin's Liberals got defeated, and then we had a PC government, Stephen Harper, and it just never came to being, and it still has not come back up into the light. We had the residential school apology in 2008, and depending on which First Nations person you talk to, whether they accept that apology or not. Some people say it's hollow, and if you take a look at the Australian Stolen Generations apology, it happened 3 weeks prior to Stephen Harper's and sounds oddly familiar. Shannon's Dream comes out of the fact that we don't have enough high schools in First Nations. So there's a lot of First Nations communities that we have a new system of residential schools where the children have to be flown out to a city to get their high school diplomas, which means instead of leaving their home at 5, they're leaving their home at that age where you really need your parents at 12 and 13. And when you are starting to rebel and trying to figure out your life, you're on your own in a city. Yes, you have a family that you're billeted with, but that's not the same as being with your own family. The Truth and Reconciliation final report comes out in 2015. Canada finally signs the United Nations Declaration of Rights on Indigenous Peoples in 2015. They'd been one of the first dissenters to that in 2007. They finally agreed to it in 2010, and then they finally sign it in 2015. But nothing's happened since 2015. That's 5 years ago. We still don't have any laws. Jordan's Principle is accepted in theory in 2016. This is about having healthcare rights or health rights for First Nations children and not having to worry about who pays for it from the province perspective. We've had the Wet'suwet'en protests from 2018 till now. It's still going on, and in fact, they keep trying to do dangerous things out there to the protesters instead of just allowing them to protest or to actually hear what they're saying. The Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls final report came out in 2019, as did the Venns Commission. And I could start adding in 2020 already the number of things. So we've had a whole bunch of wellness checks where Indigenous people were shot. And we've had 2 instances in the last 2 weeks of Indigenous people dying in hospitals from racism or racial slurs. So now I'm going to try to flip it over onto children so that you have the next few minutes are going to be about just the children's pieces that you're probably looking for. So we consider them gifts from Creator. All children are gifts from Creator. So you're seeing 2 pictures of my mom because I just love, she had long hair and then they cut her hair off so that she could go to school. So she, my mom lived with her aunts in a small area in northern Quebec because they were trying to keep her away from the 60 scoop because her mom wasn't married when she was born. So they figured that if they kept her with the aunts that already had children, that the government wouldn't notice her and that she wouldn't get taken, which she didn't, but that was the only way to get around the government policies. So when people say, does this affect you? Yes, my family didn't go to residential schools. I was fortunate that way, but they did try to take a lot of our children. In the top right hand there, you'll see me, my husband, and my 2 daughters when they were very small, and I do consider them still very much my gifts. And it's important for us to connect to the children in our lives because they bring us joy and they make us remember why we do this work. So right now in Canada, we have 52% of all children in care are Indigenous. So that's 14,000 children in Canada are Indigenous in our child welfare right now, today. And we only make up 7.7% of the total Canadian children population. So that's hugely problematic. 47% of First Nations children live in poverty compared to only 12% of non-Indigenous children. So almost half of all Indigenous children are living in families that live in poverty versus 12% of non-Indigenous. We have a huge health crisis. Right now, life expectancy for an Indigenous child is 10 to 15 years less than non-Indigenous children. So that means even at the outset, if the life expectancy is, say, 78 to 83 years, we can be expecting somewhere between 63 or less. And that's currently what I see. 400 of our 618 First Nations have been on at least one water advisory over the last year. So that means there's 633 First Nations in Canada, but of 618 that they've reported on, 400 have either had a boil alert or been on some kind of do not drink or do not use alert in the last year. That's huge. That's a lot of communities, that's a lot of people. And 58 have stayed on long-term drinking water advisories or do not consume. we have a language crisis. Only 15% of Indigenous people can use or are using an Indigenous language at home. I know that people want to, but it's hard to do when English and French seem to be predominating everything else we do. The numbers for murdered and missing Indigenous women have stayed at 1181 only because the government refuses to give up the numbers, the RCMP and the police forces. In all fairness, we think it's somewhere over 5,000 people. And that's a lot of women and girls to have gone missing or been murdered. So this is important to you, working with with children, but with Indigenous children in particular. They have a brand new act, which is the Act Respecting First Nations, Métis, and Inuit Children, Youth, and Families. And this is intended to ensure that there's changes in the way that funding is given, that there's more focus on prevention and early intervention, that there's support for communities to have jurisdictional control, and that they can work with federal services. So CAPC, CPNP, and Head Start would all be considered federal services that they would that would be under this. There's trilateral tables going on. There's a need for us to start looking at getting minimum standards for service delivery and how to develop data and reporting strategies that also follow OCAP, which is the Ownership, Control, Access, and Possession, and Indigenous data sovereignty. So this all came into effect on January 1st. I don't even know if everybody's aware, but this is all new. I'm just showing you a little bit about drinking water because there is a Drinking Water Act, and they've committed $7 billion, but since the pandemic, as far as I know, none of the things that were supposed to happen this year have happened. So we have quite a few communities that are sitting waiting, and nothing's happening because of the pandemic. This is just to give you a sense of pricing if you're in the north. So you'll see that we can buy in Ontario bottled water for what, $3 over at the grocery store. If you go to northern parts of Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and the territories, including Nunavut, that's roughly the price they're paying for bottled water. So it's important. I did some of my research in Waakebiness, so this picture here is one of the houses. No, they're not all like this, but the fact that there's any on the reserve that look like this and people are having to live in is problematic. This is that famous picture from Oka. It's just to make you think about what is it that are we still in that standoff, or are we trying to move forward? Again, just looking at the price of meat in Nunavut. I have some students that go around and take pictures of items for me because they're up there doing the research, and it's important for us to know that it's so much more expensive up there. And finally, this picture here is to show you just that, you know, when Indigenous people are hurting or they're trying to think about things, they will find a creative way around things. And so this is the Indian Act, and it's an arts installation where they beaded over the act in a way of defying it and saying that it doesn't matter. So it traveled around the country a few years ago. I'm not quite sure. I think it's at the Canadian Museum of History right now. Going back to what you might be interested in is there's a high rate of teen moms. I just did this a couple of years ago. It's very difficult to get any kind of rates anywhere. It's like pulling teeth. I've been trying every year to get more accurate data, but that's really hard. So here's just First Nations in Ontario and who has the highest rates. So right now in 2011, and I realize this is like 9 years ago, but the highest rate was in Sandy Lake First Nation, and the lowest was around the Kenora area, not necessarily Kenora the city, but the Kenora area. And this is just Indigenous teen moms, right? So I don't have Toronto or any of that data because this was very specific to First Nations. I had the province give me this data. It was really again, difficult to get. I'm sure Donna will be happy to see this. So I know, and a lot of people that work with Indigenous children know that FASD is one of the biggest issues that we've had to deal with. There's a number of resources out there now, so I really hope that you'll go out and check it out. The toolkit has been around for at least 6 years, I think now, and I really love this logo. I love the idea of, so sweetgrass is one of our sacred medicines, and we use it to heal. And so to have that as a heart around a child says that you're trying to heal them using our medicines and our ways of being. And so I really like that. And there is a growing body of evidence that FASD is higher in Indigenous communities or in Indigenous children, but I don't think there's any direct evidence at this time that I'm aware of, but it is something that we need to be aware of. So how do we move forward? So I'll just show you I got to go out west a couple of years ago, so this is a nice picture of looking at the mountains when I was going for a walk. So how do we start to move forward? Well, we need to start thinking about what I call the 3 Ps, which is power, privilege, and position. And when I say that, there's a number of things that we need to talk about. So we have to talk about your privilege. And a lot of people go, well, I'm not really privileged. I come from a poor family, or I am first generation here, but you still have more, like you have to think about what that means. So there are benefits and advantages just from who you are. And that's what we call earned or unearned privilege. So you just automatically get them. So the fact that you could emigrate to Canada, or that you were born here and you're not Black or Indigenous, already gave you unearned privilege that you may not have gotten anywhere else. Earned privilege is the idea that you can achieve something. So you go, like myself, I went and got a PhD, or you find your way through to different social circles that you find of privilege. Those are things that we need to talk about, because a lot of people think they don't have privilege, but they do. So I know for Black and Indigenous peoples, when you walk out the door, sometimes just walking out the door can be hazardous. Police will stop you. That could turn into something very, very nasty. You may not have the ability to move places, so you may be in a situation that also takes away any kind of privilege you would have. All of us have power. Governments obviously have power, so do education systems and health systems and parents. But you have power on your everyday, how you spend your money, where you go. That says to people what you value. So every time you use those privileges, and you're sitting at a restaurant, you have the power to be nice to that waitress or waiter, and to give a tip or not to give a tip. That's power, because you're wielding something over somebody else. And so you have to think about that even in terms of how you work in your everyday role, because you all have power there as well. It's just people seem to think that power means you have to be like the prime minister or the premier, and that's not really true. You have the power to make change, so please don't think that you can't. You can. Which brings me to the biggest project I'm working on these days, which is cultural safety. We need to move people from awareness, which is just you have a commitment to see other people and their identities, and you're going, that's okay. I understand there's lots of people. Towards competence, hopefully we're getting here, which is they have attitudes, knowledge, skills necessary for providing quality care to diverse populations, meaning that you're fully aware that there's diverse populations and you're willing to make changes to your attitude and to your skills and to your knowledge in order to help them be in the system. But we really need to get to cultural safety. And this is the place that most people say, you made me feel very uncomfortable. I really didn't like when you talked about this. Because now we're saying you need to go one step further, and you have to give up your power and your privilege in situations in order for Indigenous and, for the most part, Black and people of color, and trans LGBTQ, two-spirited, and disabled folks are always marginalized and vulnerable. And we need to start giving them privilege. We need to start giving them the platform to talk. We need to start giving them a place where they can be respected, and that they're not hurt because of who they are. And that seems to be happening quite a bit, specifically for Indigenous folks, but this happens for anybody that's considered marginalized or vulnerable. So cultural safety is really about you doing self-reflection, but at the same time learning about a group, in this case, Indigenous people, in order for you to be able to work as allies and as advocates. And we need people to do this. So you need to start thinking about what's your social location? What do you consider yourself? It goes back to when when I talked about identity. And then you need to think about the intersections of your race, class, your education, your religion, your culture, your gender, everything in your life, and how you are where you are and how privileged you may be. You may not even think how privileged you are because you're privileged to not think about that. So these are things that you'll need to think about as you go through cultural safety. So you got to remember the 3 Ps. What's your power, what's your privilege, and what's your position? And how do you use your power? How can you affect change in all of the spaces you're in every day? For me, I'm sitting here talking to you, so I'm hoping I'm affecting change in every space that I'm in with the amount of privilege and power I have. You need to use your privilege to assist Black, Indigenous, and people of color people. You need to be that ally. We need people to stand up and advocate, even when we're not in the room. And that tells me that you've made it to cultural safety, is when I can leave the room and you're still talking on my behalf, then I know that we've made it there. You need to use your position in order to elevate Black, Indigenous, and people of color voices. And that means that you do everything in your power to raise them up to the same level that you feel that you're at. Everybody should be equal on this wheel. So when we move across the cultural safety continuum, you start to learn all of these different pieces, right? You need to learn about how to view culture. And you should be looking at culture from a physical, a mental, spiritual, and emotional view. And when I say that, you should be looking at your own that way too. And maybe it'll highlight things for you that you hadn't thought of either. But you also have to think about the historical, the social, the economic, and the political processes in which your culture is viewed, and how does that relate to how you identify. Thinking about how your knowledge is, your awareness, your sensitivity, your humility, your proficiency in knowing about other cultures, and what can you learn more about, and where do you go to learn about that? Are you competent in understanding and empathizing with Indigenous people? Are you providing safe space for Indigenous people? Are you helping them to be empowered? So culture can be a number of different things. It doesn't have to be like the big things. It can be something small. So, you know, right now there's a moose moratorium in my territory, in the Algonquin territory, where we don't want hunters to come and hunt in, the moose, because we know that we need the herd to get bigger. But, you know, hunting seems to be pushed aside, but it's still part of our culture. As I said before, we sit in circles so that we can talk to each other and we can discuss. I'm sure you do that too, but maybe it's about talking about culture itself within your circles. You'll see teepees or wigwams. We use them often in teaching times. Right now, I know for those of you that are in the Kitchener area, you have a nice wigwam in Vic Park that Laurie Campbell and some other Indigenous people have erected there to talk about the rights and the land in the Kitchener-Waterloo area. Having a fire is sacred in a lot of ways, because we usually use that as part of all of our ceremonies. These are just some of our hand drums that way back in the day we used to make as part of the Head Start gatherings. And I'm sure you've been to powwows. This just happens to be the U of T powwow, but if not, go to some of these events. Go to places where you can learn. I thought about CAPC CPNP, and I was trying to think of things that you could do. And I think that part of it is you could have social and cultural influences within the programs. I think it's very easy for you to bring in components, whether it's you're bringing an elder or knowledge keeper in. There are Head Starts across Ontario that you could talk to, or to the Indigenous CAPC CPNP projects, and ask them if you can co-do things, because I know money is also a factor. So maybe if you were providing an event, then it would reduce the cost for both of you, and it could be for the whole community. It would also be a way for people to learn about things. How about looking at alternative activities in education? Thinking about how can you help them to work with Indigenous programs and services in the community, because there's lots going on and there's lots of people that are looking to learn. So going to alternative activities or education that would help them to just understand, but would also help them to understand their life choices, the things that they do that may be harmful to Indigenous people. Provide support and meet teen parents where they're at. So I think one of the problems that I've heard, and when I say teen parents, I think of teenagers now. I didn't when I was in CAPC and CPNP, but I do now. Teenagers are, for me, anywhere from 13 to like 25, because young parents are really not advantaged enough to understand their issues. I know the younger the teen parent, the worse it is, but or the harder it is, but I think that it's important for us to support them and meet them where they are, as opposed to forcing them to come into our programs and feeling uncomfortable or having major discomfort. It's good for us to have cultural space. And while I'm talking from an Indigenous standpoint, I think it's also important for us to think about the other cultures that come to our programs and see if there's a way that we can give them culturally safe space as well, because it can't be easy being BIPOC, regardless of which community you come from, and also be in our projects and not feel like you're connected to them. So I would say engaging parents and Indigenous communities together would be great. So having an elder or knowledge keeper or traditional practitioner come in to speak with the children, or to the parents, or to both. Make sure you have an honorarium. Make sure you're providing some token of your gratitude. So, a mug, a pen, a lanyard, something, just to show them that you actually care about them coming in. Talk with parents and guardians about activities or readings that they can do at home, as maybe they just didn't know that they could get books, and I'm going to show you them in a minute. But maybe they just didn't know they could get these kinds of resources. Talking to them about the fact that there's APTN even, so Aboriginal People's Television Network. I know it's on everybody's televisions, but we sometimes forget that it's actually there. Create safe spaces for all of your activities and building relationships. So making sure that there's spaces for elders and knowledge keepers and Indigenous people to come in and be part of your activities would be good. And then providing lists of readings or other resources that, whether they're Indigenous parents or non-Indigenous parents, can actually look at and use. And so sometimes we forget about that. And here's just a list. I mean, you can Google lists of Indigenous books, but some of these are great and I love them. So Sweetest Kulu, that's an Inuit book. What's the Most Beautiful Thing You Know About Horses? The Elders Are Watching, Rabbit and Bear Paws, Sacred Seven. The Mishoma's book could be for both children and parents, because it talks about Indigenous culture, very much Anishinaabe culture. Black Flies. So Robert Munch and Jay Ojic have done two. There's also Bear for Breakfast is the other one. I was trying to think of it. Bear for Breakfast is actually in English and Algonquin, so you can get it in. It has both in the book. Owls See Clearly at Night, When We Were Alone, and I have another group, Granny's Giant Bannock, but I don't know if you can get it in stores because it's one of my friends wrote it. And then there's many others. And then you can think about doing some land-based activities. When I say that, maybe you have the knowledge keeper or the elder come and they do a nature walk. This can be really good with children, especially 0 to 6, because they can go out and touch things and feel things, and we're not worried about what they're touching and feeling because you can wash their hands, right? And they're, getting to know nature in a very great way. And if you do it young, they'll love it longer. Do community gardens, not just veggie gardens, but do traditional medicines. I grew traditional tobacco this year for the very first time. My tobacco was 8 feet high. I have 2 very large bags of traditional tobacco that I can now use when I'm talking to elders and going out to see community. So again, you can do that. Find out what native plants are from your area and maybe plant those with your kids and the families. Veggies are great, but sometimes it's about other things there, right? And conduct some programs outdoors. So this is not land-based learning, but place-based learning. So the difference is place-based learning is taking your curriculum and taking it in different places. You can take it outdoors or to another classroom. And when I say land-based learning, that means you're doing the first one, which is you're out and using nature to teach. So I think that they're both very important and can really help stimulate growth and development. I work for Waakebiness-Bryce Institute for Indigenous Health. You can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. This is just a quick plug for us. I founded the Turtle Island Journal of Indigenous Health, so you can go on. We just published our very first issue. It's a graduate student-led journal, which helps to get our word out there for graduate students. If you have time, this is another great video to watch. It's I'm Not the Indian You Had in Mind by Thomas King. He wrote a nice poem about this, but then there's this video that they have. Eighth Fire is a great series that was hosted by Waakebiness. Gives you a lot of information. It's on CBC. It's easy to access on YouTube. And I will stop there and wait for questions.
Angela. My goodness. Here, I will come and join you.
I hope that's what you were looking for.
I should say so. I'm just filled with such gratitude, and my brain is just is spinning with so many wonderful things. So yes, we are open for questions now. Feel free to type them in the chat or to pop on camera or unmute yourself and ask. I will say, as people are thinking about their questions and what they want to ask you, I guess when I express gratitude to you, Angela, I know for me, you've given me so much food for thought in terms of my own growth in thinking about opportunities for me, just how you even began with introductions and how I'm introducing myself and how I can grow in my territorial and land acknowledgements. So thank you for that. And this opportunity you brought us to be reminded and talk about our history, because you're right, it is so important. And we can be tempted to just, that's all in the past. We want to move forward. Why are we, going back? And we do need to be willing to really understand where we've come from and how we've come to this place. So you've done such an amazing job in taking us through this journey. So I'm really grateful. I do have a question, but I want to just check and invite our participants to post any questions they might have in the chat or to unmute themselves. I do have a question here about the slides, and you did indeed send me the slides, and I will share it with the link to the video for everybody. We do have a question here. What has the Ontario government done so far, from your perspective, Angela, to implement the TRC's calls to action? Do you have anything you want to comment on that?
Before the Doug Ford days, or now? Because before the Doug Ford days, before Kathleen Wynne left, she was changing up education quite a bit. She had teams who were creating TRC related curriculum for K to 12 and trying to work with the ECEs in order to create curriculum for them as well. Doug Ford came in, and the very first weekend that he was in, they were all supposed to be coming to Toronto on the Monday for all these different teams.
Right.
And they got an email on the Saturday afternoon that none of their travel was allowed.
Oh,
So
wow.
he canceled all of the curriculum development. This was pre-COVID, by the way, just so everybody knows it wasn't a COVID-related issue. And he canceled it all. So what do I feel they're doing? They're giving a lot of great lip service, but I don't see a lot of movement. The fact that Doug Ford has moved Aboriginal affairs in with mines again tells me what his thinking is.
Right. Yeah, it's an indicator for sure. Well, I have a follow-up question for you, Angela. How are the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the TRC's call to action linked? How would you respond to that?
Well, they're both about making sure that Indigenous rights are upheld in Canada, right? So TRC, so the thing is, TRC highlighted the actual issues. The UNDRIP is the framework by which we can make policy or legislative change.
Okay.
And so they're linked in that regard, but what I'm noticing is governments are so confused about Indigenous rights that they've just kind of went, not doing any of it.
Right.
So they can hear it and they're not moving things forward. So there's 94 calls to action, and unfortunately, I haven't actually seen the government force in those 94 calls to action. Now, some of them weren't directed at the federal or provincial governments, but what I'm seeing is that nobody's really taking them up. They're taking on task force or making working groups, but nobody's actually making the action part of it. So they're saying, oh yes, we understand it, but I don't see the action items happening.
Gotcha. Thank you. Well, I think I have one last question for you, Angela. Thank you so much for the ideas you gave us around programming and thinking about our spaces in terms of that cultural safety piece, like moving from awareness, which is a good place to start, to that safety piece where we're more being guided by the needs and the voices of the families that we serve. Do you have any ideas or suggestions for programs in terms of actually making that initial connection, maybe like promoting ourselves?
Well, okay, so there's tons. You guys have tons. Okay, first of all, I'm going to call out all the program consultants that are on here. So Blanca, Sobia, Donna, right? They have tons of places that they can connect you to. They know all the Indigenous CAPC CPNP and Head Starts. That's your first role. Why not just go talk to your other counterparts for one, because they may have resources. Friendship centers. Almost everybody will have a friendship center within like a stone's throw from you. There's Métis councils across Ontario. You know, just look them up, Google them. They're not hard to find. The Inuit, specifically if you're in the Toronto area, so, and when I say Toronto area, that doesn't mean just Toronto, but the GTA, GTHA, whatever you want to call it. There's the Inuit, Tungsivit has a Toronto, or TI has a Toronto version now. So if you're in that area, they can help you out there if you're looking for Inuit resourcing. If you're looking for early childhood stuff, I have a student who hopefully, by the time we're done talking about all this, will have gotten her job. She's going to Ryerson School of Early Childhood, and she's an Indigenous scholar, Nicole Inishi-Nash. So again, going to the scholars, like there's very few of us, but there are some of us, and talking to them and asking them, like, what resourcing do you have? Just simple Google searches are going to give you a lot of information and a lot of places to make connections. But I mean, you have some wonderful folks at the Indigenous CAPC and CPNP.
Thank you. That's really very helpful. I'm actually going to make that list and share it out with everybody. Angela, you're getting a lot of affirmation and gratitude in the chat. I think I do spot one more question if you are feeling you have time.
Sure.
We have a question about the books that were recommended. Were those for children? Thank you. Are there any other books that you would recommend for us as CAPC or CPNP project staff to read for our own education?
I look that way because my library's that way. So
your shelves there.
I'm just looking at it and going, no, but I would point you to, so not a book per se, but I would point you to the National Collaborating Center on Indigenous Health, so NCCIH.
Wow. Yeah, they have so much, don't they?
Yeah, they have tons there. Yeah. They have tons on children too, Indigenous children and children in particular. So I think it's important for you to just kind of look around because you might find some stuff there.
That's really great, and I'll include that in the archive, the link to them.
And I am writing the book on Indigenous early childhood, but I'm not finished yet.
Okay, so we keep our eye open for you. Are you on the social media there, Angela? Can we find you there and follow you there?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter. I'm at ARMP71, and I'm on Facebook.
Great. We'll have to make sure to follow and to keep an eye on what's coming out from you. Angela, again, thank you so much for your time. It was really great to have you here with us this morning and to hear your wisdom and your knowledge, and thank you for sharing it with us. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day, and I want to thank the folks who joined us here from our network. It was great to have all of you here. I just want to let everybody know that I did put a link to an evaluation for today's webinar in the chat, but I will also email it out right away, and would really appreciate your thoughts on this event. We like to get our feedback for all the events that we do. And I think that's about it. I think we're ready to say goodbye. And yes, again, just wish everybody a wonderful rest of the day, a wonderful weekend. And Angela, again, thank you so much for your time. And I hope we can stay connected.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And if you guys are looking to do an MPH, my MPH in Indigenous Health, the application's just opened on the 14th. So if you're thinking about it, come on over. We're doing our open house next week. Virtual.
Great.
Yeah, virtual.
Wonderful. And how would people find out about that?
All you have to do is either follow me on Twitter or look on Facebook or Twitter for Waakebiness-Bryce, so the WBIIH.
Great. Thank you so much, Angela. Take care, and thank you, everybody. And watch the newsletter for more upcoming events.
Thank you.
Take care, and goodbye.
Miigwech.
Miigwech.